Guess they didn't teach IMF agents how to copy and paste back then. Hey everybody, welcome to Mainly Movies. With the release of Mission Impossible 7 later this year, today I'm going to be kicking off my Mission Impossible review series with the first film in the franchise, 1996's espionage thriller, Mission Impossible. If you're new here, please consider subscribing for a variety of movie-related content like reviews, rank lists, and trailer reactions. All my reviews include a breakdown of the pros and cons, my rating, and some tailored film recommendations, so be sure to watch through to the end of this video for all of the extra content. Mission Impossible stars Tom Cruise, Jon Voight, and Emmanuelle Béart. It was directed by Brian De Palma. It tells the story of IMF agent Ethan Hunt, played by Tom Cruise, who must track down a mole in the agency to solve the mystery of an attack on his team. I'm a really big fan of spy movies, and of spy franchises, as you could probably tell from my reviews of the entire James Bond series. But unlike with Bond, I had no pre-existing childhood connection to the Mission Impossible franchise. I never watched the original show, and to be honest, up until I was around 15 years old, the only things I knew about this franchise were the theme song and that classic vent-repelling scene. The first movie of the franchise that I ever watched was the third one, in theaters, and I really enjoyed it, so I went back to watch the first film as well as the sequel. I've watched all of them many times at this point, but I still feel like I have a bit of an unusual relationship with this franchise because I started with that third film. As with most long-running franchises, it's always very interesting to go back and watch the first film with the knowledge of the trajectory that the franchise would end up taking. Not just in terms of the plot points or character development, but also more generally with regard to the tone, genre, and scope. This first film is very different from the rest of the franchise. To be fair, the first three all have their distinct flavors, but this first one especially feels almost like it's from another franchise altogether. From the second film on, this has been a very action-oriented franchise. And there are certainly moments of action in this film, but not even close to the levels that we see later on. Instead, this is a mystery story. It's an espionage thriller, but much more of a suspense-driven slow burn than what we would typically expect to see in a modern spy movie. The script certainly contributes to this, but Brian De Palma definitely had a big hand in this from his seat in the director's chair. His style is all over this movie, which I think is a big reason why this film feels so different from all of the others in the franchise. There's this tense uneasiness to the atmosphere, almost one of paranoia, which is fairly fitting for the story being told. Lots of mysterious foggy scenes, echoing footsteps, faceless assailants. Even the cinematography contributes to this uneasiness, with a lot of close-ups and a ton of Dutch angles. Maybe an excessive amount of Dutch angles. But all of this works to put both us and Ethan Hunt on edge, and in a position of trying to solve the mystery. As seems to often be the case with spy franchises, this first movie is perhaps the most classic espionage-centric film of the series. This is the case not only with the plot, but with the way the plot unfolds. There are gadgets galore, and although some elements feel a little silly, the frequent unmaskings for example, I think the espionage stuff really enhances the story, and adds to the suspenseful atmosphere. In fact, arguably the most iconic sequence in the film, and perhaps the entire franchise, is a great example of this. The infiltration at Langley is fantastic, mixing spy gadgetry with excellent editing and sound design to craft a sequence that's equal parts suspenseful and exhilarating. Speaking of exhilarating, we do have to talk about the action in this film. I suppose you could stretch and call the Langley sequence action, since it did involve some pretty impressive practical stunts, but I view it as more of a suspenseful plot point than true action, at least in the Mission Impossible sense. Like I said before, this first film is easily the least action-intensive of the entire franchise. To be honest, I personally wouldn't even classify this as an action movie. There are a few fight sequences, as well as a dramatic aquarium scene, but the only full-fledged action sequence in this film is the finale, and it's okay. I always hate to knock on films when the issues stem from technological limitations of the time period in which it was made, but the action here is very dated, and the green screen effects make the film feel quite a bit more campy now than I think it was ever intending. But, of course, this isn't an action movie. It's an espionage thriller, and from that perspective, I think Mission Impossible is moderately effective. It's got the suspense, and it's a very stylish movie, but the plot is less than ideal. The premise is fine, a fairly classic spy-burning mole hunt story. The problem is the way in which it's executed. It's all just a little too complex for its own good. I'm all for spy movies having twists and turns, but this story is just excessively convoluted. And although the overarching story is simple enough for the audience to follow along, there are aspects of it that are unnecessarily confusing. And even now, having rewatched it many times, I still find myself feeling a little lost at points. It works, and by the end you have a fairly good sense of what happened, but the process to get there is just a little too complex and a little too overly convenient. All that said, I still think this is a decently strong start to the franchise. It's got some really great spy sequences, a suspenseful and mysterious atmosphere, and manages to remain interesting and entertaining in spite of some of its storyline shortcomings. It's certainly a movie that can stand alone, but it also really sets the stage for what's to come in the franchise. Not so much in terms of the tone, since this is definitely the outlier of the series in that regard, but more in terms of our introduction to the characters, especially to Ethan Hunt. He's the common through line of this franchise, and really, its heart. So this film serves as the setup for what we now know would become a multi-decade character arc. Alright, let's talk about the pros and cons. The biggest pro has gotta be the suspenseful atmosphere. This is an espionage film where the characters don't know if they can trust anybody, so the paranoid uneasiness imparted on this movie by Brian De Palma's style is really fitting. Combine that with a spy story full of espionage, intrigue, and gadgets, and you've got a film that frequently puts you on the edge of your seat. There are plenty of suspenseful moments in this movie, but by far the most effective and iconic has gotta be the Langley infiltration sequence, which is all but guaranteed to have you holding your breath. On the con side, the biggest issue has gotta be the plot. I do like the premise, and I like the idea behind the story. It's just way more complicated and convoluted than it needs to be. Now, I'm not saying that glamorized spy movies like this are ever realistic, but this one's too complex for it to seem plausible even within the context of a spy story. Things just piece themselves together a little too conveniently for it to ever elicit any real surprise at the big twisty reveals. Which is unfortunate, because I think this movie was so hung up on trying to be twisty and surprising that it introduced an unnecessary degree of complexity, when a tighter and more sleek story would have been more effective. The second con is the action. I gotta say, it definitely feels weird to be putting the action on the con side for a Mission Impossible movie. And it's going here for this movie not because there wasn't enough action. Again, this isn't an action movie, but because the action that is there is a little rough, mostly because of the CGI. Like I said before, I always feel a little bit guilty when I criticize the action and digital effects of somewhat older films. I mean, I'm looking at the movie now with the benefit of having seen 25 years of additional technological advancement, but the finale places so much emphasis on its CGI that it's impossible not to focus on it. It's still entertaining, but probably in a different way than it was at the time of release, being more campy now than intensely exciting. Before I give you my rating and recommendations, I want to remind you that if you're interested in buying Mission Impossible or any of the other films I mentioned today, I do have affiliate links for all of them in the description below. I get a small commission from anything you buy using one of my links, so I'd really appreciate it if you use them if you're in the market for any of these movies. I'm gonna give Mission Impossible 3 out of 5 paws. In spite of its fairly convoluted plot, it serves as both a good introduction to Ethan Hunt as well as an interesting espionage story that manages to tonally differentiate itself from the rest of the franchise. I would recommend Mission Impossible to anybody looking for a spy story that isn't dominated by action. There are certainly a few moments of action here, but it's much more of an atmospheric espionage mystery thriller, focusing on building suspense rather than bombarding us with constant action set pieces. I think people who enjoy the original Mission Impossible TV show will appreciate the utilization of classic elements of the show, as well as the inclusion of the character of Jim Phelps. But this film still serves as a good standalone introduction, even for somebody who's never seen a single episode of the original show. If you liked Mission Impossible, I would recommend Mission Impossible 3. The second film veers a little too far into bombastic action territory, but the third movie is a nice middle ground, segueing between the mystery thriller elements of this first film and the action thriller elements of the later films. It also provides for more expansion on the character of Ethan Hunt, beyond just his role as a spy. If you liked the espionage elements of this movie, you should check out the second James Bond movie, From Russia with Love. It's perhaps the most espionage-centric Bond film, plus it features another exciting train action climax. And if you want another movie featuring a spy on the run, you might want to watch Salt. It's a little bit more action-intensive, but it has some plot similarities, plus a reliance on disguises by the main character. Alright, a couple questions for you guys. Number 1, have you seen Mission Impossible? If so, what'd you think of it? And number 2, what's your favorite movie based on a TV show? Be sure to leave your answers in the comments below so we can get a discussion going. Alright, so if you got some enjoyment, insight, or information out of this review, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that like button. And if you haven't done so already, please hit subscribe or add it to see more videos like this. Till next time, this has been Alyssa with Mainly Movies. The way life should be.